Welcome to the scandal that shocked not only the United Kingdom, but also the world of quiz shows. This is the story of how a British Army Major, Charles Ingram, seemingly won £1 million on the iconic quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, only to have it taken away when a complex web of deceit and trickery was exposed. The fraud is now famously known as the coughing scandal, involving not just Charles, but also his wife, Diana Ingram, and another contestant, Tecwen Whittock. But how did it all happen, and what exactly was the role of each individual in this notorious cheating scandal? In this video, we'll explore the entire incident piece by piece and reveal how this seemingly unbelievable con was carried out right under the noses of the show's producers and audience. The story begins in September 2001 when Charles Ingram, a seemingly ordinary contestant, made his way to the hot seat of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, a popular quiz show in the UK hosted by Chris Tarrant. Prior to Charles's turn, his wife, Diana Ingram, had already appeared as a contestant on the show and won a modest amount. Their experience with the format and familiarity with the pressure of the show should have given them a fair advantage. However, Charles did not seem to have a particularly strong start. In the first few rounds, he stumbled on questions that were relatively simple and gave the impression that he would not make it very far in the game. However, something extraordinary happened as he progressed into the tougher questions. Charles, who appeared to be struggling, suddenly started providing correct answers to questions that even seasoned quiz enthusiasts would find challenging. What was more perplexing was his odd behavior. He would often read out all the options, dismiss the correct answer at first, and then, after a long pause, suddenly change his mind and pick the correct option. It seemed almost as if he was receiving some external assistance, but how could that be possible? He was in the hot seat alone, without any lifelines left. This suspicious pattern raised eyebrows among the show's producers, but nothing could be confirmed at that moment. It wasn't until they reviewed the footage that the shocking truth emerged. It turned out that Charles was not playing alone. Two other people were secretly helping him cheat: his wife, Diana Ingram, who was seated in the audience, and a fellow contestant named Tecwen Whittock, who was positioned behind the scenes. The method they used was simple yet effective: coughing. Tecwen Whittock, a college lecturer, was the key accomplice in this scandal. As Charles read out each possible answer, Tecwen would cough discreetly to signal the correct option. For example, if Charles was struggling between options A and B, and option B was correct, Tecwen would cough after Charles mentioned option B. This subtle yet effective signal guided Charles through some of the trickiest questions on the show. Diana, on the other hand, seemed to play a more passive role, appearing calm and composed in the audience, but occasionally giving affirming glances to her husband whenever he seemed to hesitate. As the show progressed, Charles's erratic behavior became more noticeable. He would often reject a correct answer outright, only to circle back to it after a moment of contemplation. The more he hesitated, the more frequent the coughing from Tecwen became. This pattern played out multiple times, but neither Chris Tarrant, the host, nor the live audience seemed to suspect anything. They were too engrossed in watching the drama unfold. By the end of the night, against all expectations, Charles Ingram had answered every question correctly and walked away with the £1 million prize. The audience erupted in applause, and Charles was hailed as the latest Who Wants to Be a Millionaire champion. However, behind the scenes, the show's producers were not convinced. They immediately ordered an investigation and began meticulously analyzing the tapes from that night. As they watched the footage, a clear pattern emerged. Every time Charles was uncertain, a cough from Tecwen Whittock could be heard, guiding him to the correct answer. What was even more incriminating was that Tecwen had no reason to be coughing so frequently. It was too deliberate and too perfectly timed to be a mere coincidence. With this evidence in hand, the producers contacted the police, and the Ingrams, along with Tecwen Whittock, were charged with deception and brought to trial in 2003. The trial was a media sensation. The public was fascinated by the audacity of the scheme and the cunning way it had been executed. Charles Ingram maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, insisting that the coughing had been nothing more than a coincidence and that he had answered each question based on his own knowledge and intuition. Diana, too, defended her husband, claiming they were victims of a massive misunderstanding. But the prosecution had other ideas. In court, the prosecution laid out their case in painstaking detail. They played the recordings from the show, highlighting each suspicious cough that coincided with Charles selecting the correct answers. They argued that Tecwen Whittock, who had sat in the fastest finger first section, was feeding Charles the correct answers using a simple but effective system of signals. The defense, meanwhile, tried to argue that Tecwen's coughing was a result of a persistent throat condition and that any correlation between his coughs and the correct answers was purely coincidental. But the jury didn't buy it. After a long and highly publicized trial, the verdict was delivered. Charles Ingram, his wife Diana, and Tecwen Whittock were all found guilty of procuring the execution of a valuable security by deception. Charles and Diana were each given an 18-month suspended sentence, and Tecwen received a 12-month suspended sentence. Additionally, they were all fined heavily, and Charles was stripped of his £1 million prize. Although they avoided prison time, their reputations were irreparably damaged. Charles Ingram became known as the Coughing Major, and his name became synonymous with cheating and deceit. But the story doesn't end there. Even after the trial, Charles and Diana Ingram continued to maintain their innocence. They appeared in several interviews, claiming that they were the victims of a miscarriage of justice. They argued that the evidence against them was circumstantial and that the coughs were nothing more than a coincidence. However, the damage had already been done. The public perception of them was firmly set, and they became infamous figures in British pop culture. In the years following the scandal, Charles tried to capitalize on his newfound notoriety. He appeared on various reality TV shows, including Big Brother and The Weakest Link, but he could never shake off the stigma of being a cheat. His military career was over, and his social standing was shattered. Tecwen Whittock, on the other hand, faded into obscurity, his reputation destroyed by his involvement in the scheme. Today, the coughing scandal remains one of the most famous quiz show frauds in history. It serves as a reminder that no matter how clever a scheme may seem, cheaters rarely prosper in the end.